The way we think about decentralized finance is that it is a financial infrastructure, and in the sense that we have a kind of like a longer, bigger vision about at some day DeFi as it is as a financial infrastructure could be used by anyone, and anyone has access, and it has a global adoption as well. Obviously, like we're all here, and some of you all, including me, Sergey, we've been here for a few years in the space, and we are kind of like the early adopters of the technology, but also the whole ethos behind of decentralized finance and what it really means. And I've been thinking quite a lot about this over the years because I started Degen, the predecessor, Eatland, from the perspective that I just wanted to build something cool, something better, something more interesting that I have seen in traditional finance. And in fact, like before building DeFi, I built a decent amount of fintech applications, and some of the things that really was annoying is that they aren't really kind of like the best that we could have. Like if we have this technology where we can actually communicate across globally, and we can have global payment rails, why finance is so difficult today, right? And why it can't be like one big borderless market where everything is just based on best execution, best offers, and trades, and provide like the best experience, right? So, and that's how kind of like the auto vision started. But over the years, I've been thinking of like, well, now that we've built something really cool, and we have this whole space of decentralized finance, and we all enjoy the amazing yields that we get from DeFi. But like the next question is that how do we get the other, the mainstream people to use what we built, and how do we get this kind of adoption? And I do think for DeFi specifically, I think the progression there would be that it starts as a technology, as with early adopters, enthusiasts that really believe in borderless economy. We all travel all the time. We all visit different cities, and we do business across the globe. But the financial system isn't actually reflecting the way we create financial relationship or business relationship, or even how we make friends and connections. So with DeFi, the way I see it is because it's being open source, and most of these protocols are kind of like an open systems where anyone can come and contribute and build. It reminds me of the similar kind of like a playbook of something like other bigger open source projects like Linux, for example, or database systems like MySQL or Postgres as well. So the way I see the adoption and traditional capital markets is that as the technology starts to prove itself, there's more time and more iterations of these existing protocols, and we can, as a community, prove that protocols like Aave are resilient, open platforms, transparent risk management, all these kind of interesting things that exist in DeFi, and non-custodial access and so forth, as we can, over the years, prove that it actually works better, and it's a better way to make finance more efficient and equitable, because everyone has the same access to information. That starts to slowly get more and more adoption, and I think that's where the more of like traditional capital market participants will come and get more interested, because now we have people who are participating in capital markets, like among us, maybe even today here, brought here by the curiosity. But at some point, it becomes more than obvious that it's a better way to do finance on chain. So I think we were in a phase where finance became part of online, and we're moving to a phase at some point where finance is going to be part of on-chain and mainly done on-chain.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I think that the thing that always fascinated me about DeFi even in the early days, was it's a protocol that anyone can access permissionlessly. And I think what you're saying is that as we improve the security, as we improve how it works, that capital markets will be one of these groups that eventually accesses it permissionlessly as a protocol. Because all of these finance systems have a lot of friction for you to access that. And it's also not predictable for me how they work.
Yeah.
And it's not predictable to me how solvent they are. And I think in working with the capital markets, they're actually very aware of this. They're very aware that they have counterparty risk that they can't evaluate, and that there's all kinds of weird conditions under which they can join a system, leave a system. But with Aave, it's this protocol, you can read everything in the protocol, you can read all the contracts, and you can come and go as you prefer. And you can validate, where the data's from, through Chainlink and so on. So I think there's so many things that you can know about Aave that just make it much more attractive than a traditional institution. I think right now for a small subset of people, like the people in this room and other rooms like this. But I think the fundamental value is definitely there, where I feel like you can know a lot more about Aave than you can about some traditional capital market system.
Yeah.
And yeah, does that make sense?
And it's really fascinating because it's kind of like a really big paradigm shift. It's like we're all the time sending like links of like transactions, like interest kind of links, and something interesting happened on chain, and it's very kind of like a habit or like a social behavior that is happening on ongoing basis in our space, but you can't really do the same on more traditional markets and capital markets. And I think that's kind of like, I even think that the whole idea of open source, it has been like an interesting way of getting DeFi and also some of these blockchain networks to get adoption. But I also feel like it's kind of like a little bit of like a Trojan horse in the sense that, if we can build a system where everyone, has the transparency and they can access to these markets, and they have the same equal access to read the information and make their financial decisions based on that. That's just like a better definition of creating markets. So at the end of the day, regardless if we're thinking about on-chain, online, or traditional ways of exchanging value, it's just about more of how we can make a better place to actually do business in that sense. And I think that on-chain is very good for that because you can create an execution environment where not just they have the transparency, but also the rules apply to everyone, the same way. So I can, for example, or anyone from our team can't go and just bend those rules that are on the smart contracts, and they just execute the way they have it. That's the beauty of the system. And I do think once we realize that how we can actually apply the same technology to these traditional assets, and that's where, for example, real-world assets come into play, that will gather a lot of attention because crypto and digital assets are, it's still a niche, and a lot of, for example, funds or institutional participants in markets, it's not really a category that they might be looking into. But as a form of technology, you can use the same technology neutrally and apply to any kind of value that is outside of the blockchain and make it on-chain, verified, for example, with the proof of reserve type of functionality, and make it even programmable and create different kinds of layers that build utility on top. And I think that the really big value here is that we can also quantify the risk better. So if we are able to quantify the whole financial system from end to end as much as possible, we can build a more better risk management framework. And on top of that, if risk is priced and managed accordingly, what happens is that the cost of the capital and all the cost decreases there. So effectively, I think one way is that we get more of traditional assets onto the blockchain, And then we actually start seeing that because it's a better execution environment, yet you have lower cost, it's easier to actually quantify systemic risk. That's something that we will basically see as a benefit towards traditional paper-based systems, for example.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think one of the things you said was really attractive. Like when SVB was happening, I think you had situations where people that have certain positions with the bank or something to get their money out sooner than others, and other people might not even know that's happening.
Yeah.
But with Aave, everyone is on a similar playing field regardless of their relationship with anyone else. And, everyone can see what's happening. So
Yeah.
it's a huge improvement.
And to that point, actually, what's fascinating is that, like that kind of issue can actually extend to quite far. For example, on chain, if you actually see some sort of activity, you can actually quite quickly, see that social behavior there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like, even if there's some sort of information asymmetry or there's some sort of insider advantage, you can actually spot it quite easier compared to a system where you don't have the same visibility. I don't know who said this, but like basically, like revolution cannot be achieved in a quarterly basis, which basically means that like if you want to build a future, you need real-time data, and that's basically how many of these blockchains operate.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the topic of stability and all these kinds of questions, stable coins are an interesting topic that also got a lot of attention during the SVB thing, and people I think started to wake up a little bit to the value of DeFi and these systems. So the Go stable coin, what do you feel that can offer the same capital markets folks, this larger universe of users, crypto users? So how do you view its adoption and its value?
It's quite interesting because the Auto protocol started as a more of a liquidity protocol where you draw cryptographic assets that other suppliers are providing into the protocol. And Go is basically a one step further of actually the Auto being able to actually create a bucket for the Auto protocol to mint an native stablecoin. And the idea there is that because you have this liquidity markets and there's the fluctuation between the rates, so most of the rates on the protocol are pretty much variable, meaning that it's based on supply and demand. And Go is something that brings the prediction of these interest rates and at the same time creates this kind of like additional tool to quantify your, for example, borrowing costs and whatnot. So it's basically a tool for the borrowers. And but what's the kind of like a bigger vision of Go is that obviously as a more of a decentralized DAO, the idea of Go is to have a very decentralized alternative in the stablecoin ecosystem. But at the same time, we know that down the line what will happen is that to get this space to grow and get DeFi to grow as well, it's going to be quite clear that some of the assets that are off-chain, they need to come on-chain. And that's where also these real-world assets come into play because we have to figure out how do we scale the existing finance and get it on-chain. So from Go's perspective, that's one kind of like an angle where we'll see some sort of institutional growth. And there's another interesting, I would say, vision to this more of a real-world asset vision is the real-world utility. So I think there's still kind of like a asymmetry between being able to actually earn on a stable value globally. And it's really hard to actually see from the perspective that we're living. For example, we have a stable currency in most of the Western countries, but there are parts of the world where actually we don't have the same opportunity. In fact, we don't have the opportunity to actually have access to US dollar in any case. And what I think is fascinating about decentralized stablecoins and with that stability is that there is enormous opportunity for distribution and empowerment. And distribution means that anyone with a cell phone and internet connection could be in the reach of distribution of a stable asset in creating a global economy, which I find, like, from a technological standpoint, very fascinating. But also, what stablecoins and DeFi can actually do is that they can provide the same yield opportunities that we have in some part of the world, making available to everyone in the stable value. And I think that's something that is really, I would say, like, underserved at the moment, but it's something that is really empowering. And there are times in DeFi where the interest rates are quite low, people lose interest in DeFi very quickly. It's very rate-driven behavior. But there's times like now where these rates are quite high and significantly higher than the traditional yield markets, and that creates additional kind of like excitement about opportunities of DeFi. And I think with real world assets, what's going to happen is that as more we're going to put more value on chain, it also means that these real world assets, people want to actually utilize the liquidity that is locked in these assets by being able to borrow against. And what that creates again is that demand for on-chain stablecoins. And I think that's kind of like a cycle that feeds itself. So the more assets we get, off-chain assets onto the blockchain, the more there's actually need to unlock that capital and more demand for stable coins and stablecoin yield, and eventually creates a more bigger interest market that anyone can actually tap into.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I hope that wasn't too complex, because that sounded really complex.
No, I mean, I think it makes perfect sense. I think real world assets coming in my opinion, will create a real diversity of collateral. I think that's been one of the really big issues in the DeFi world. That's even led to certain failures where the collateral is always so crypto heavy. And if you have more real world assets coming in, I think you have a greater diversity of the collateral that's affected by crypto being robust or some other problem in the world. And I think that collateral being diversified will actually create more stability generally across various protocols, lending protocols, stable coins, and so on.
I would be curious to also hear, Sergey, from your point of view, what would you say would be the Chainlink's role in this kind of like bridge between traditional finance, real world assets, and DeFi?
Sure. So I think all of DeFi, the Web3 world, is the place where a lot of the initial design patterns have emerged. And I think that's the place where the most advanced versions of things will continue to come from, because it has the least amount of limitation. But at the same time, you have literally hundreds of trillions of dollars in value in the traditional system that people are comfortable with. And somehow you have to get both of these worlds to interface. So really you want to create a single world, right? You want to create a single interconnected world where you just have one, what we call Internet of Contracts, right? So there isn't like a bank internet and an insurance internet and a gaming internet. It's like one internet, right? We're all on one internet, together with all the banks and all the gaming companies and all the insurance companies and so on. So fundamentally, what I think you're trying to do when you create a data transmission layer and a value transmission layer like Chainlink is you're trying to create a single Internet of Contracts, because all of the data and all of the value can flow freely between DeFi applications, capital markets chains, and everywhere, right? So right now it's still these two parallel worlds that are developing separately and in parallel to each other, but I think they're fundamentally involved in the same activity. They're fundamentally doing the same exact economic activity, just with different groups of people and slightly different legal requirements. And as the legal requirements become clearer I think they will converge into one group of people, basically. And the way that looks practically for something like Aave is capital markets users that have their value on a Bank of America chain or a Goldman Sachs chain or Lloyd's of London, whatever, just whatever the bank chain is, they will want to use Aave.
Bank chain.
Yeah, because it's just easier and easier to get a chain, right? Like it's becoming easier and easier to launch an L2 or your own chain or something. So they're all just going to have their own chains. And then they're going to, I think, want to use Aave. And then the question is, how do they rely on Aave? How do they know the security of Aave is there? And I think that's something that Chainlink has played a big role in helping generate that security. And then there's the question of how do I connect to Aave from all of these different bank chain environments. I think that's kind of the next challenge to solve on an infrastructure level from my point of view. And then Aave, I think, will remain a really attractive place to put capital and value, including these real world assets, right? Which will actually make it a more stable place.
And do you think, maybe that the question also here is that the space has been growing quite a lot, and I would some ways argue that obviously DeFi is still very small at the moment, so I think we were reaching 100 billion recently in terms of the total value, which is kind of like a new metric of measuring the on-chain AUM. Well, my kind of question is that as the stakes are growing on an ongoing basis, so let's say that if we're going to see, who knows, like 1 trillion worth of value in DeFi, let's say, in a year, just don't quote me, but like, let's say that will be the case. What's the kind of like unique value proposition from Chainlink point of view? Because I think like decentralized Oracle networks are a little bit of a mystery, especially for the newcomers to understand obviously how they function and basically how they secure. But maybe because you're here today, it will be interesting to know like what is Chainlink kind of like that uniqueness towards the security and how do you think about it as the stake in DeFi is growing in terms of value that is in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think Oracle networks generally should scale their security to what they secure. So as the value secured continues to grow, I think you'll end up seeing maybe higher quality nodes with better performance, more nodes, a number of other guarantees about maybe the technology that the nodes use. So the difference between Oracle networks and blockchains is blockchains are a single chain that generates basically blocks of transactions in a single place. But Oracle networks, there's literally thousands of Oracle networks, right? Thousands of individual Chainlink networks that generate different pieces of data. And as that piece of data or as that connection starts to be related to more value, the scale of that should increase, right? The scale of that security should go in lockstep with the value in some form. The quality of the nodes, I think right now the networks are having a lot of nodes. Generally, there's probably an overemphasis on the amount of security, which is the right thing to do. But if we start reaching the $1 trillion level, the other level, I think that the amount of security should increase. And likewise, then the fees for the security might also have a different dynamic around what they need to be. But at the end of the day, Chainlink is really made to scale its security relative to the value it secures over time. And I think that's also the thing that makes it attractive for the capital markets. Because the capital markets are going to need to look at a system, and they're not going to just need to evaluate your smart contract code. They'll definitely evaluate that, and they'll definitely be happy to understand and see how transparent and clear everything is within the Aave protocol. But they'll also need to see the other systems connected to Aave and that they're providing necessary security. So the real goal of the system is to reach this high level of security guarantees.
And that's basically part of the Oracle design, because it's really a complex field. Just for kind of like a background details, I think we created our like own little Oracle back in 2017, and I kind of like remember that half of our team's work went to just maintaining this protocol and trying to basically get it into a shape that it's functional and it works well. So for teams and like protocols like Aave, it definitely kind of like solves one really important piece of component. And I think it's really underestimated like how hard this Oracle field is, because the prices and price movements are really dynamic. So obviously asset valuations, they can go extremely high or low depending on some unexpected movements or events. And designing a good Oracle that basically ensures that that doesn't create an anomaly or, let's say, some sort of like unexpected fluctuations is it kind of like feels very like a difficult challenge to solve, and I think that's where Chainlink has been quite successful so far. Switching a little bit gears, so we both started when Ethereum was pretty much the only network where people were building. Obviously, there was other types of blockchains, but like an interesting question is that now that we start seeing this kind of like a multiverse, or how do you mention? Yeah, multi-chain, but also like what you mentioned of internet of contracts and these different networks. And the question is that what kind of approach Chainlink is taking in this cross-chain, multi-chain world, and also maybe I would like to ask like how many networks you think there's going to be, and that's something that probably everyone has as a question in their mind, that are we going to see that there's going to be maybe 20 rollups of queues, or are we going to see like hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands? And I don't know, I would really want to get you to choose a number on that question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll choose a number. I think it's going to be probably, do you mean like instances or individual technologies?
Basically what people call like networks.
Okay, I think there'll be thousands.
Thousands, yeah.
I think there'll be thousands. I think the thing with blockchain technology was before people were trying to scale it to create a single network, a single thing, and they were saying everyone's going to go in a single thing, and we're going to get native composability, and that's how we're going to achieve a lot of goals. And that story kind of changed a few years ago to it's good to make replicas, right? It's good to replicate what a blockchain does across multiple instances and basically do load balancing. And that's kind of how L2s have come to emerge as the preferred approach, because scaling a single instance isn't something that seems very achievable. So I think if that's the direction of let's make a ton of replicas, and that's the effort that everyone is now involved in, is how to more efficiently make replicas of blockchains, yeah, you're going to have thousands of different L2s. There's also a very big incentive because the ability to make money by making a blockchain, making a token, getting VCs to get the token, flipping the token, making some more money, and the VCs take a portion of that, they do it again, right? So as long as that dynamic continues to exist, the incentive to create more blockchain technologies will exist. And what all of this does really is it creates a large amount of fragmentation about the technology, and that technology fragmentation creates a fragmentation of liquidity, right? Of all the value that people can use to buy real-world assets, or they can generate real-world assets on all these different chains. And that fragmentation, I think, creates a big limiting factor, right? Because even if I make a great real-world asset and I make it on my own chain, but it's not connected to all the other chains where someone can buy it from, then my market's relatively limited. And so this is the real problem CCIP is seeking to solve. And the way it's seeking to solve it is similar to the dynamics you described with the complexity of Oracle networks. Oracle networks kind of solve this long-standing problem of I have a single Oracle, but the single Oracle can't be relied upon to control too much value, right? So Oracle networks were invented by Chainlink and came about to move data into blockchains. But really the cross-chain problem is also the movement of data, because the movement of tokens is basically data, just moving across chains. And so the same security model that moved data into chains can absolutely move data across chains. And because of all the value that the Chainlink kind of model and the Chainlink decentralized Oracle network security model has enabled, and so far CCIP has been enabling securely, I think that it'll really just come back to the security, right? Because what you don't want is you don't want to connect your DeFi protocol to an insecure data feed that'll then corrupt it and have value loss. You don't want to connect your network, your DeFi protocol to another blockchain network, and then in that connection you lose value, right? And this is something that's not, I think, super duper fully understood yet by capital markets.
Yeah.
But they have security teams that are actually going to have very stringent requirements for both the data and the cross-chain. So our fundamental approach is the same as always. It's basically generating security for these critical interactions, so that as the critical interactions happen between data or between different blockchains, you don't experience risk and you don't experience loss. And then the next question is kind of how much more data can you put into something like a real-world asset? But I'm actually very eager to hear your views about how you see real-world assets going on to, define the DeFi industry and how you see them interacting with all of it.
Yeah, speaking of like CCIP, like I didn't want to come and brag, but we did make our first test transaction from Ethereum Sepolia to Arbitrum Sepolia through Chainlink CCIP. So that's very much done. So our kind of like understanding is that there's going to be obviously like an automatic copy pretty much on a network where you will have to have some sort of a liquidity layer. And I think a lot of these networks that start in the beginning, they have one type of utility that they're planning. You have more general purpose, let's say L2s like Optimism and Arbitrum, but quite quickly that these newer networks that L2s we're going to see, they have one special purpose. And it always starts like that, but quite quickly these networks realize that they really need liquidity. So if blockchain is kind of like asset creation or tokenization machine, that also means that financial market will exist there, whether if there's some sort of a value there. And softwares like the protocol or the Chainlink protocols, these are the things that basically exist and have to exist in every place of this blockchain world where there is some sort of a need for financial layer, one way or another. And obviously, like some of the things that we've been more concerned is that our protocol has been in 12 different networks at the moment. So we have more deployments coming in, and it's not a secret that we're looking also into non-Indian networks and building a version of Ovid in those places. But for example, for us, what's interesting is that in some of these networks, if the Ovid DAO, for example, can't move quickly enough or doesn't want to move quickly enough to deploy a version of a protocol, and there's different kinds of security concerns related to that and due diligence before network deployment. So we see kind of forks going before the actual official deployment. And one of the concerns we have is that many of these teams that fork the protocol, they don't really kind of know necessarily the code base properly, or we get a feel from their questions that they're not really professionals in terms of security or even great developer practices. So sometimes it's kind of like we get a feeling that there's someone who wants to fly like a plane without the actual kind of experience. So that's kind of one of the things that we think about when it comes to security and risk and all this networks. So I do think that overall a lot of these networks, they will have liquidity layers, but some of these networks, either they're built on top of the L2s or they have some sort of a way of actually borrowing the financial layer from another network and having that kind of messaging between where there's actual liquidity and where you can trade and another network. So I think this is where CCIP is fascinating, because you could actually, with CCIP, you could trade in another network and do financial transactions without actually moving all that capital into that network where you don't necessarily want to have a new version of Aave as an example. I find it really fascinating, and I do believe that's the same kind of like a bet that there's going to be probably like thousands of blockchain networks, and they will have, many of them will have a copy of Aave protocol. They will have Chainlink oracles and then the CCIP in between. I also think about kind of like in a similar way. And I think that a lot of this networking is going to be abstracted away from the users. So all this thing about like, switching networks in MetaMask and sort of bullshit, well, I think that will disappear quite quickly. But also from developers' perspective, that's, a lot of that networking will go away. And I think that's how it should be. Like when you are, pinging the internet and you're sending and receiving data, you don't have to like go from one place to another in terms of like the data transfer. Like the way I see the blockchains work today is kind of like, I don't know if I was not living in during that time, but I've seen pictures of telephone exchanges where there was people working and switching, all these connections, and that's how the blockchain is basically built today. Well, guess what? Today we basically are using, phones, making calls, using different networks, telecommunication networks, without actually realizing that there's some sort of a switch in the network. And obviously that's all based on trust, but the blockchain version of this future is trustless, verified, and that's the future, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's actually a great analogy. Don't be surprised if you see a video somewhere of me explaining it that way. So that makes a lot of sense. I think we only have time for maybe one or two more questions. So one of the things that I just wanted to get a sense of was how you see all of this evolving, right? So we see the capital markets doing more blockchain things. We see DeFi growing now also as the crypto markets grow. How do you see, I briefly described internet contracts and all these types of things. So how do you see things eventually evolving between DeFi and the capital markets, and kind of how do these two parallel worlds evolve? How does that all work out over the medium to long term, let's say the next 5 to 10 years, something like that?
Yeah, I think financial markets in general, they move very slowly. So the way I just observing the progress of DeFi, and we have more and more users coming in. We quantified that we have over 1 million addresses interacting with all these different deployments of our protocol, and that's also an outdated number. It's much more these days. But in general, finance works really slowly. So things to get actually adoption within the finance world, it really takes time. And it goes with the capital markets as well. So things like what was interesting, in a big opportunity, let's say like 20 years ago, where Asian markets were exciting, getting there and getting kind of like a global equity markets was something that took time as well, and every single other example as well in finance. So I won't expect kind of like even if there will be high incentives, let's just say that you'll get let's say some ridiculous number for a DeFi yield. I don't know, like 400% yield, or like is that ridiculous enough? I think it's ridiculous. Yeah, that's ridiculous. So let's say like we have a market of like DeFi for 400% yield for like a year, and I do think that brings some institutions, some people into the space. But I would say those folks are folks that actually come and take the arbitrage opportunity. So they see that, there's arbitrage, I'm going to come and take the carry trade from here.
So you feel it's the yield, right? The yield is going to drive the transition.
I think yield drives the kind of like the arbitrators of the traditional finance that realize that something is happening there. There's a free lunch, like I'm gonna get that free lunch, and there's gonna be turkey on my table. That's basically, I think, that's for arbitragers. But the actual adoption is way more slower. So let's say that's when we think about like more and more like bigger funds, professionalized investments and whatnot, it just takes a long time in finance. And there's a reason for that, because obviously financial system is complex, but it's also very traditional, but also built in the sense that you have to, you have to compound that reputation and success rate. So larger institutions, they sort of want to move if the opportunity exists here for, let's say, for the next 5 years. But if this is going to be, revolutionary, if this is going to change the way everyone is going to do finance or create markets in the future, obviously that's a more interesting thing, and it just takes more time. So DeFi might be in the same little bracket in the next 5 to 8 years, but once it kind of like gets that interesting, like a pivotal moment where it's getting accepted everywhere, there's clear rules, clear processes of development, risk management, and everything is just becoming more and more clear and familiar. The familiarity is very important, that we shouldn't underestimate. And in that case, after that, let's say 5 to 8 years, DeFi is just gonna like take all the waves, and it's gonna be implemented in every place where you have outdated technology. And I think that's totally fine. Like, I personally don't want the whole financial system to change overnight. I think that's a little bit crazy. And I think, I think there's still a lot of to build in this space. Like, I don't think DeFi is anywhere near a whole financial system that could be just scaled to everyone. It doesn't have all that necessary tooling. The experience can be better. Managing funds from like multi-sig or institutional perspective is very nascent still. I think we need that like 5 to 10 years to basically get everything set up so that DeFi can actually scale. But it's going to be fun because end of the day, this is going to change finance forever until the next thing will change DeFi. But I think that's the kind of timeline I'm thinking of.
Yeah, makes sense. I think there's still some ways to go, but I think we'll definitely get there over time.
What do you think is really vital to get more institutions into the space? As a kind of last question, because your Chainlink is in a very interesting position where you are providing data sources, and quality is important, and real-world asset has an interesting component where you have this on-chain data structure that anyone can audit, but then with the proof of reserves, for example, that's a kind of like a tooling for off-chain assets as well, and improving those reserves. So my kind of last maybe posing question for you is that, also I want to know what's your favorite drink as well later, but like, is that what do you think is important that we need in the space to get more real-world assets and institutions income?
I think at the end of the day, your instinct about yield to a certain degree is right. But I think at the same time, when you have a $2 trillion market, that's actually big enough for institutions to want to provide products into. So I think on the one hand, the yield of the DeFi ecosystem will be attractive to a portion of the capital markets. But really, the simple market size, if that goes from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 10, that market size in and of itself will be attractive. The big hurdles there will be legal hurdles of how do I legally interface with Aave, how do I legally interface with chains, with protocols on public chains. And then there will be a technical hurdle of how do I technically execute transactions? How do I verify the data of the transaction for settlement? How do I connect to this other chain where Aave might be, or to another chain where I also have Aave or something, some other set of connections. So I think what we're doing is we're just setting up all of the infrastructure and all of the open source standards for all of that data and all of those connections to happen in anticipation of really, I would say, basically 3 things. One is that the legal clarity will appear and that there won't be these legal hurdles. The other one is that the yield and the value that DeFi provides will continue to be there and grow. And then also that the market size of the crypto industry as a whole will continue to grow. Because if it goes from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 10, at some point it gets so big that even the biggest financial market players can't ignore it. And I think we got on this path in an inevitable way when we went past 200 carriers. And so now the question is, how does, obviously secure while still innovating, providing new markets, new capabilities, how does Chainlink enable infrastructure that allows that to happen, that allows the whole industry to connect better, to get new types of data, to generate new real-world assets with that data. And personally, I'm very hopeful because I see smart, thoughtful people like you, like your team, continuing to work the problem. And I've been in this industry for a long time, and I'm continuing to work on the problem. So I think we have people that are already experiencing these problems, and like your humility about, hey, everything isn't perfect, everything isn't built, everything isn't ready, I think is the right point of view, because it shows that there's a lot more stuff that needs to happen. But the fact that you and me probably a few years ago, like 5 years ago, you asked us how close are we to getting this all done. It was like, it's easy. You just got to do these 5 things and it'll be done. And now, 5+ years later, we're like, man, there's all this stuff to do.
It was way more easier when it was just a hitting. It was. I kind of like. That's an interesting discussion because I didn't expect to see the scalability to happen the way it's happening today with volunteers. That was something a little bit later, and then that also increased the kind of idea of we're gonna have these different networks of internets, and that's where we need a lot of data. So yeah, I think our lives is way more complex now than it was 5 years ago. That's how I feel today.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the opportunity is also there, so it's worth it. Well, Sonny, it's really been a pleasure chatting with you. I appreciate all your thoughtful views and candidly sharing with us what the right trajectory is and what the limitations are. It's always, my pleasure to speak with you. I always learn a lot. And I want to thank you for coming to the event and speaking with me. And excited to be doing even more great things together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I suggest everyone now takes the time just network and meet everyone else, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. Cheers.